The air in Boston, 1878, felt thick with the weight of granite and expectation. It was a good weight for most men, a promise of stability and commerce. But to Elias Vance, it was a shroud. He stood by the window of the brokerage firm on State Street, his expensive wool coat smelling faintly of cigar smoke and the sea, watching the ceaseless human tide flow past. He was 29, nominally successful, and deeply, irrevocably restless. Elias was a man built for motion. His frame was spare but taut, his hands accustomed to gripping reins more than ledger books. His father, a man whose ambition had been perfectly calibrated to the narrow confines of New England finance, had seen his son's energy and steered it toward money. "A steady pulse, Elias, is the sound of prosperity," the old man had once lectured. But Elias's own pulse was anything but steady. It beat with the furious rhythm of a hammer against rock, searching for a fault line. The immediate cause of his discomfort was the contract lying on his mahogany desk, a merger that would net him a considerable fortune and, crucially, bind him forever to his father's world. He had negotiated it flawlessly, sealing the fate of 2 shipping companies, and, he felt, his own. He picked up the fountain pen. It felt cold, heavy, like a small gilded chain. He thought instead of the West, not the romanticized West of dime novels, but the real, brutal place described in the hurried, ink-stained letters that arrived weekly from his cousin Finn. Finn had left 4 years ago, trading stocks for soil in the Nebraska territory. His letter spoke not of gold or glory, but of wind that could carve stone, of isolation that was both frightening and profoundly free. "Out here, Elias," Finn had written last month, "you don't buy a future, you build it, one aching log at a time." He placed the pen down. He looked out at the street again. A family was leaving the harbor, piled onto a cart, a mother, a father, and 2 small children, their possessions wrapped in rough linen. They were likely heading inland, perhaps seeking their own small patch of earth. They looked tired, anxious, but in the mother's tightly held gaze, Elias saw a flicker of something he lacked: purpose. He was already rich. He had prestige. He had a fiancée, the lovely and socially impeccable Miss Eleanor Thorne. He was on the pre-approved track to a life of comfort and consequence. Yet he felt like a locomotive idling on a sidetrack, waiting for a signal that would never come. His soul was not in this city of stone and glass. It was somewhere else, chasing the horizon, smelling the distant scent of pine and unturned soil. With a sudden, decisive motion that startled his junior partner in the corner, Elias stood up. The merger could wait. The city could wait. He needed air, not the salty, damp breath of the Atlantic, but the vast, dry, unlimited air of the Great Plains. The decision, though terrifying, felt like the first honest breath he had drawn in years. He knew with an absolute certainty that the real story of his life was not to be written in a Boston ledger, but across the unforgiving canvas of the West.
The scent of dust and leather was a more intoxicating perfume than any a Boston chemist could distill. 2 days after his abrupt decision, Elias found himself in a cramped, musty office above a bustling livery stable, not signing a merger contract, but poring over maps of the Western territories. His original unrest had been existential. Now it sought an anchor in the material. Finn's letters had ignited the spark, but the fuel was a particular kind of American dream, a feverish, compelling need to own something truly his, something forged by his own sweat and risk, not inherited through a handshake. His father, of course, had reacted with predictable, thunderous rage. "You speak of building a future, Elias? We own futures. We control the flow of grain from the plains to the world's table. You want to trade a king's seat for a dirt patch?" Elias remembered the cold, hard logic of his father's voice. "We control the flow, Father, but we do not know the source. We are brokers of potential, not creators of it." The core of his motivation lay in a document Finn had included in his last letter. A crudely drawn map detailing the new federal land grants near the town of Hastings, Nebraska. This was not the flash-in-the-pan promise of the California gold rush, which was all wild gamble and greed. This was something subtler, more profound, the whisper of grain. Finn wrote, "They say gold makes men rich, Elias, but it's the wheat that builds empires. Out here, land is cheap and fertile beyond your city imagination. A man with a sturdy plow, a clear head, and enough grit can turn 50 acres into a lifetime. The railroads are coming. They need the grain to feed the East, and we can provide it. We won't be dependent on your tariffs and your market games. We'll be the foundation." This was the economic siren song that resonated with Elias's restless spirit. He had spent years maneuvering capital, buying low, selling high, always dealing in abstracts. The West offered a tangible return. Plant a seed, watch it grow, harvest the yield. It was an honest, quantifiable equation, one that stripped away the suffocating layers of Boston's social and financial pretense. He calculated his assets, the sizable inheritance from his mother safely outside his father's direct control, and the liquidated assets he'd acquired before the merger debacle. It was enough to buy quality equipment, provisions for the journey, and a significant parcel of land in Nebraska. He was not going west to escape poverty. He was going to escape comfort and the sterile certainty of a predetermined life. He needed to trade his wool coat for rough denim, his ledger for a rifle, and his prestige for the fierce, solitary pride of a frontiersman. He was no farmer and no rancher, but he knew how to manage resources, and more importantly, he craved the accountability. If he failed, it would be his own fault, not a market correction or a competitor's move. This was the true gold he sought, self-reliance. He folded the map, the cheap paper crinkling under his thumb. The financial incentive was real, but the deepest motivation was the knowledge that in Nebraska he would not be Elias Vance, the son of the powerful broker. He would simply be a man with a patch of earth, an open sky, and the chance to prove his worth beyond the measure of his inheritance. The whispers of gold and grain were for Elias the sound of freedom calling him home.
Elias had been under the illusion that his journey west would be a solitary pilgrimage, a rigorous proving ground where only his own character would matter. The reality of the frontier, however, demanded coalition. He learned quickly that a single man and a single wagon were little more than a morsel for the vast, hungry land. Safety lay in numbers. Thus, the third week of April found him not alone, but amidst the controlled chaos of Independence, Missouri, the historic jumping-off point for the Oregon and Santa Fe trails. The air here vibrated with energy, a volatile mix of hope, fear, and sheer logistics. It smelled of green wood, axle grease, sweat, and freshly baked bread. Elias, now stripped of his Boston finery and clad in rough canvas and buckskin, felt a strange lightness. He was just another face in the crowd of dreamers. Yet this anonymity was the liberation he had sought. He found his wagon, a sturdy, canvas-covered behemoth he had purchased and outfitted with supplies according to Finn's meticulous lists: 300 pounds of flour, coffee beans, salt pork, ammunition, a heavy Sharps rifle, and a surprisingly large number of seed packets. He was still a tenderfoot, but he was a well-funded, well-prepared tenderfoot. His immediate task was finding a train, a small, reliable collection of families and individuals heading for the Central Plains.
He was approached by all types: optimistic German families, hardened mountain men, and shady characters promising shortcuts and protection for exorbitant fees. Elias, the former broker, had a keen eye for assessing risk, and he waited. He found his answer not in an organized pitch, but in a woman named Clara Jenkins. Clara was not leading the train, but she was its undeniable anchor. She was a widow from Ohio, heading west with her teenage son, Thomas, and her younger sister, Lila, a fiercely quiet girl with startlingly clear blue eyes. Clara was mid-40s, her face weathered by worry and work, but her movements were precise, her voice low and authoritative. Her husband had been lost to a fever the previous year, leaving her with a small inheritance and a powerful conviction that her family's future lay beyond the Mississippi. Elias first encountered her while she was fiercely negotiating the price of a draft ox, her back ramrod straight as she faced down a grizzled dealer. "$70 is robbery, sir," she declared, her accent betraying her Midwestern roots. "He's not pulling the Union Pacific. He's pulling 2 barrels of pickled cabbage and a prayer. 60 and not a dime more." Impressed by her grit, Elias stepped in after the deal was sealed. "You have a formidable head for commerce, madam," he said, touching the brim of his new broad-brimmed hat. "And you, sir, have the look of a man who's traded a comfortable chair for a very uncomfortable ride. Where are you bound?" "Nebraska territory, Hastings specifically. I have land claims." "We're heading to the Platte River Road, then south near Kearney. We have 3 wagons, ours and those of the O'Malley family. We need one more reliable hand to make the company safer. More eyes, more guns." The deal was struck quickly. Clara was looking for stability and protection. Elias was looking for instruction and acceptance. He formally joined their small, tight-knit group. The O'Malleys, Patrick and Moira, were Irish immigrants from New York, loud, joyous, and utterly terrified. Patrick was a huge man, a former dock worker, whose strength was matched only by his anxiety about snakes. Moira, perpetually pregnant and always humming a low, tuneless melody, provided the warmth and endless, slightly burnt biscuits. Their wagon was packed not just with supplies, but with the hope of escaping the tenements and owning a piece of the earth that had always denied them. Elias learned his first crucial lesson immediately. Preparation was survival. Clara put him to work, not simply paying for his inclusion, but demanding his effort. He learned to check the wheel axles for cracks, to waterproof the canvas with linseed oil, and to pack supplies not for accessibility, but for weight distribution, the difference between a smooth ride and a broken axle 30 miles from civilization. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the gathering grounds, Elias stood slightly apart, watching his new companions. Patrick was struggling hilariously to rope his mule. Thomas, Clara's son, a boy of 14 already looking like a man, was sharpening a hunting knife. Lila, seated quietly on the tongue of their wagon, was mending a tear in the canvas with focused intensity. Her silence was a stark contrast to the surrounding noise. Elias was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a component of a fragile, moving machine. The individuals gathered here were bound by a shared delusion, the belief that the rewards of the West were greater than their dangers. He looked at his wagon, now fully stocked and ready. It was no longer a symbol of his reckless flight, but a vessel of collective hope. The wagon train was gathering, and with it, the raw, unpredictable narrative of his new life. The final morning in Independence was not a celebration, but a ceremony of commitment. A thick fog, smelling of the nearby Missouri River, clung to the wagon grounds, softening the harsh edges of the canvas and muting the sounds of departure. It was 4 a.m., and the collective breath of the 100-odd souls preparing to move west hung visible in the cold air. Elias had not slept. He had spent the night checking the harnesses of his 2 draft horses, ensuring the canvas cover of his wagon, dubbed the Vance Venture by Patrick O'Malley, was battened down against the morning dew. He felt strangely calm, the high-strung anxiety of Boston replaced by the simple, immediate task of survival. He was no longer battling market forces, he was battling gravity and friction. The O'Malleys were already wide awake. Patrick, with a great sigh of resignation, had tied a small, tarnished silver cross to the yoke of his lead ox. Moira, despite being heavily pregnant, was stoking a dying fire, her silhouette framed by the embers as she brewed a last cup of town coffee, a luxury they would soon forego for the thin, bitter trail brew. "A good day for a start, Mr. Vance," Moira whispered, offering him a tin cup. "The fog keeps the sun from beating down on us too early. A soft beginning for a hard road." Elias took the coffee, nodding. He glanced toward Clara's wagon. She was standing, perfectly still, her sister Lila beside her. Lila's eyes, usually fixed on her needlework, were now directed toward the eastern horizon, as if trying to memorize the sight of the familiar world before it vanished behind her. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of solemnity and profound, unsettling anticipation. The signal came not with a flourish, but with a single, mournful blast of a horn, sounded by the train's appointed captain, a taciturn former scout named Harlan. It was the sound of the umbilical cord being cut. One by one, the wagons began to roll, the groaning of wooden wheels sinking into the mud, mingling with the lowing of the oxen. Elias climbed onto the seat of the Vance Venture. He took a deep breath, his knuckles white on the reins. This was it, the final, irreversible step. Behind him was a life of wealth and easy comfort. Ahead lay 2,000 miles of unforgiving wilderness and the promise of a dusty, hand-earned future. The first few hours were brutal. The road was a rutted, churning mess of mud and stones. Elias, having only ever driven a carriage on smooth city streets, struggled with the heavy rains. His wagon lurched, threatening to spill its precisely packed contents. Sweat soon replaced the morning chill. He could hear Patrick's loud, despairing curses echoing from the wagon ahead of him. Clara, riding side saddle on a sturdy mare, fell back to ride beside Elias. She didn't offer sympathy, only instruction. "Ease the reins on the down slope, Vance. Let the animals feel the ground. You're trying to control them with your hands. You need to control them with your voice. And watch the left wheel. There's a rut that will break your spoke." Her tutelage was relentless and without charm, but Elias welcomed it. It replaced the abstract anxieties of his old life with concrete, solvable problems. He focused on the rhythm, the squeak of the axles, the heavy, measured plod of the horses, and the rising, relentless glare of the sun as the fog finally lifted. As they cleared the immediate vicinity of Independence and the last timber structures of civilization disappeared behind a rise, Elias looked back. The town was gone, swallowed by the horizon. He was truly adrift, a tiny speck in a line of wagons pushing west. It was Lila, later that afternoon, during a brief halt to water the animals, who unwittingly offered him a deeper perspective. She was sitting by a small creek, dipping her hand into the cold water. "It is a strange thing," she said quietly, without looking at him, "to choose where you start your life." "Most people don't choose, Miss Lila," Elias replied, adjusting his belt. "They are born into it." "But you chose to leave. You had a life, a fine one, I imagine. To abandon the known for dust and maybe nothing, that takes a kind of courage, or a kind of desperation." Elias stared into the clear water of the creek. "Perhaps they are the same out here." Lila simply smiled, a rare, fragile curving of her lips that transformed her serious face. "Perhaps, but now you are truly on the course you set, Mr. Vance. The sun is in your eyes, and it will not turn back for you." Her words were a stark validation of his decision. He felt the vastness of the American interior pressing in on them, daunting and beautiful. They were setting a course not just for a geographical destination, but for an entirely new self. Elias stood up, ready to face the afternoon sun, no longer Elias Vance of Boston, but simply a man heading west, his fate tied to the squeak of his wagon wheel and the unwavering rhythm of the pioneer trail.
The first week on the trail was a brutal education in humility. The high romance of departure, the idea of the frontier, was swiftly dismantled by the physical grind of the reality. The wagon train, a company of 7 families and a handful of solitary men, including Elias, under the stern command of Captain Harlan, moved at a relentless pace of 15 miles a day, a rhythm dictated by the endurance of the draft animals and the setting sun. Elias quickly discovered that all his meticulous Boston preparations had failed to account for 2 crucial, inescapable elements: his own softness and the trail's absolute indifference. His expensive, sturdy wagon was sound, but his body was not. The constant jarring motion turned his muscles to fire and his tailored clothes to rags. By the 3rd day, the skin of his hands was blistered and raw from the rough rains, and his shoulder ached perpetually from the necessity of walking alongside the horses for hours, easing their burden and his own discomfort. The sun became their constant, blinding companion. It rose in the east, burning off the morning dew, and tracked across the enormous, unbroken sky, pressing down on their heads like an anvil. Elias, accustomed to the shaded, narrow canyons of city streets, felt exposed, vulnerable, and diminished by the scale of the plains. His chief instructor remained Clara Jenkins, whose sharp commentary was both a punishment and a lifeline. She saw through his polite demeanor to the city man struggling to adapt. "You're staring at the horizon again, Mr. Vance," she observed one evening as Elias sat cleaning his rifle, his back against a wagon wheel. "The view is fine, but it won't get you to Nebraska. Watch your horses. They're eating too fast. They'll founder before we hit the Platte." Her constant scrutiny grated on him, yet he recognized its value. He found himself studying her in return. Clara embodied the severe practicality necessary for survival. She did not dwell on the past or romanticize the future. She focused entirely on the immediate: water, feed, fuel, and the integrity of the wheels. The O'Malleys, Patrick and Moira, provided the train's emotional counterpoint. Their despair was as loud as their hope. Patrick, terrified by the endless silence and the strange new insects, which sing boisterous, off-key Irish songs that somehow manage to lift the spirits of the entire company. Moira, despite her advanced pregnancy, never failed to share her food, her compassion a rare and precious currency on the trail. One afternoon, Elias watched as Patrick struggled to right a cask that had rolled off his wagon. The big man was drenched in sweat and on the verge of tears. Elias, without a word, stepped in and helped him lift the heavy barrel. "Thank you, Elias," Patrick panted, wiping his forehead. "Back in New York, I could lift a ton of cargo, but here, it feels like the land itself is pushing against you." "It is," Elias agreed, the shared exertion forging a bond stronger than any Boston handshake. "It doesn't care about our contracts or our claims. It just requires the effort." But it was Lila who most intrigued him. Clara's younger sister remained a silent enigma. She walked almost all day, never taking a turn on the wagon seat, her presence a faint, steady shadow. She rarely spoke unless directly addressed, and her work was always meticulous, whether mending clothes or sketching the vast landscape in a small leather-bound book she guarded fiercely.
Elias tried to engage her once, commenting on a sketch she was quickly hiding, a delicate, precise rendering of a cluster of prairie flowers. "That's beautiful, Miss Lila. You have a remarkable talent." Lila looked up, her blue eyes sharp. "It's not for beauty, Mr. Vance. It's for memory. The prairie will swallow everything we see. I draw to prove we were here, and that these flowers existed before the wheels crushed them." Her words struck a deep chord in Elias. He had come west to create something tangible, but Lila was focused on preserving the memory of what was being destroyed, the virgin land, and perhaps the innocence of the travelers. Her perspective was a stark reminder that their journey of ambition was also a journey of inevitable destruction. As the days blended into a cycle of dust, heat, and exhausting labor, Elias began to find a new rhythm. He learned to read the sky for changing weather, to identify the best grazing land for the horses, and to sleep lightly, the sound of the sentry's calls filtering into his consciousness. His initial restlessness had not vanished, but it had been channeled. The discomfort became his new normal, and the constant demand for physical effort suppressed the existential unease that had plagued him in the city. One evening, as the train camped near a small dry creek bed, Captain Harlan gathered the group. His face was grim, etched deeper by the trail dust. "Folks, we're ahead of schedule, which is good, but we're about to hit the Little Blue River. It's been a wet spring back east, and the reports say she's running high and fast. The ferry's out. We'll be fording it ourselves." A collective murmur of fear swept through the camp. River crossings were the most dangerous part of the journey, the point where human effort and careful planning often dissolved into the sheer, uncontrollable power of nature. Elias looked at his sturdy wagon, now feeling fragile. He looked at Clara, whose practical mask had momentarily slipped to reveal a flicker of deep apprehension. And he looked at the river's path on Harlan's crude map, a wide, dark line that seemed to mock their small, determined route toward the setting sun. The easy days were over. The arduous journey had just begun, and its first great challenge lay ahead, a cold, surging promise of danger.